you know all the stories. We know.
Actually, would you have you got your phone? Will you make sure it's on silent?
I don't have my phone.
That's okay.
So, if I do too much talking, can you edit it?
Oh, you can of course, don't worry about that.
Okay.
Yeah. Not enough talking is a different problem. You know, it's harder to deal with. We'll introduce you first as Toss Gibbons, one of the most active members of the parish. I think it's fair to say.
On walls anyway.
Yeah, and the exact person to give us a history of Lahardane. So, do we know when the village started?
Yes. So will we start?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, folks, you're very, very welcome to the village of Lahardane in the parish of Attergool. Now, the reason why I mention that is we know that Attergool was here for a hell of a long time. In fact, the earliest reference, or the earliest known reference to Attergool, dates back to the year 1198. That is 917 years, back to 1198. Sorry, 819 years. It is recorded in the Vatican archives. It is listed as, in Latin, as Inter Factum Lahardane, which could translate into English as between the forks of Lahardane. Translation to Irish would be Attergool Lahardane. Attergool, hence the name of the parish. Sometimes spelled Addrigoole, sometimes spelled Addergoole. I prefer the Attergool pronunciation. Now, how that came about was, we know that way back in the year 1014, the Danes who had conquered all of northern and western Europe were utterly defeated by Brian Boru, the King of Ireland, at the Battle of Clontarf. They were completely destroyed. They left Ireland, left most of their possessions in Europe, and they settled in northwestern France, an area now known as Normandy. Yes, in a very short time, just 52 years later, they were capable of conquering England. When William the Conqueror came over and defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Now, the most thing that struck them after conquering England was the difference in the way the church was ruled on the continent and in England. On the continent is a very good hierarchical system whereby the country was divided, or the countries were divided into dioceses ruled by bishops, and the diocese subdivided into parishes run by parish priests. Whereas when they came to England, they found that the monasteries still controlled the church. Then when they came to Ireland 103 years later, in 1169, when Strongbow came to Ireland, and they conquered Ireland, at least conquered Leinster first, later conquered all of Ireland, and they found that the church was the same here as it was on the continent. Sorry, the church was the same here as it was in England, where the monasteries still held sway over everything. So they decided again they would introduce the continental system. Eventually they made their way down west, and a few years later they were in County Mayo, and they discovered there was still a monastery in Killala. So they called this area the Diocese of Killala. Then wherever there was a little church, they named a parish after the church. And here in this area, there are two peninsulas jutting out into Lough Conn. One is the Eru Peninsula, the other the Maspero-Cornicilla Peninsula. And between the two peninsulas, or the two forks of Lough Conn, there was a little church. The church still standing there over the graveyard. And they called that between the forks of Lough Conn, or it had already been called that, between the forks of Lough Conn, Attergool. So they named the parish Atterpool. That's how our parish has got its name.
Fantastic.
Now, between Lough Conn, halfway between the shores of Lough Conn and the foot of Nephin Mountain, now they are the two great features within the parish. But about halfway, equidistant and about halfway up, you have the little village of Lahardane. Lahardane, half the elevation. So we're half the distance and half the elevation, and hence the name Lahardane. Now Lahardane, as we know, has been here for quite a long, long time. It had all kinds of people, but nobody famous, probably other than the great Archbishop Michael of Tuam, known still as the Lion of the Fold. He was one of the wonderful nationalist archbishops in Ireland. He was a young child here, said to be about 7 years of age, in 1798, when Humbert came through Lahardane. In fact, it is said that he was at the funeral, walked to the funeral with his father, the funeral of Father Conroy, the parish priest who was executed. So he is famous for that. We had another well-known person, I suppose, who happened to be my wife's grandaunt, born here in the village of Lahardane. She was married to a man called Crampton from County Mayo as well, who was a member of the British Foreign Service. He had risen highly in the ranks of the Foreign Service. But there was one position that was being held for somebody else. And the position became vacant, so he was made acting governor of the Bahamas. But he wasn't made real governor of the Bahamas. The position was being held for somebody else they had in mind. And that person came to the fore 2 years later when he abdicated as King of England. And he and his wife, Mrs. Simpson, took over the Bahamas. So Mrs. Simpson actually succeeded a Lahardane woman as governess of the Bahamas. So we always remember that. There were a few other very, very important people. For instance, Father Conroy, parish priest here in 1798. He lived just up the road here a little bit, up the Beaufield Road. Didn't have a church as such, but there was a mass rock back there. Now we hadn't got Catholic emancipation at the time. Now in that year, Humbert arrived in Killala. Some of the Irish patriots had gone over to Napoleon and asked him for help. So he sent Napoleon, or sent General Humbert over to assist the Irish people. So he landed in Killala. He took over Killala the very first day, then sent a messenger into Ballina, a man called Welch from Crossballina, sent into Ballina with a note. But when he got into Ballina the next day, the first person he saw was Welch hanging from a tree. However, he did manage to conquer Ballina quite easily. And the following day he set out for Castlebar. He set out for Castlebar. People came to him and says, "You're doing a very foolish thing. One of the biggest battalions of troops in the country is stationed in Castlebar. They know you're coming. They're expecting you. You'll be wiped out in a matter of hours. Take a different route." So Humbert immediately cut cross country along the north shore of Lough Conn and into Lahardane. He spent 2 days in Lahardane actually. When he came to Lahardane, the only person who could speak to him in French was the parish priest, Father Conroy, who happened to be educated in France. He advised him very strongly against going directly to Castlebar. But he said there's another route up the Windy Gap, and you'll be able to get in the back way into Castlebar, possibly unknown to the British battalion. In fact, he says one of the volunteers here is from that area. He knows the area intimately. And there's one huge problem. You would have to go through about 3 miles of bog. Try to pull your artillery behind you, get your horses and all your carriages and your weapons in. He says the ideal person to guide you is Captain Mangan, or is William Mangan. He wasn't captain at this stage, is William Mangan. So he called in William Mangan, asked him a few questions, or somebody asked the questions and interpreted it. So he gave him the rank, he commissioned him, gave him the rank of captain, and put him in charge of leading the French into Castlebar. So he did that. Went through the various hills, found exactly the right way to approach Castlebar without being seen. And as he marched down the town, the British army was all facing towards the Foxford Road. And some of the women says to him, "Don't stop one of them, stop them all." But the result, to this day, that area of Castlebar is known as Stawall Hill. So he got in, and they discovered, well, they didn't discover at that stage, but the way the British battalion was organised, the least experienced troops were all at the back. And as they had more experience, they were going more to the front. So when Captain Mangan gave the order to attack, waved his sword, attack, and they rushed, and the less experienced troops in the back panicked and ran. And when they ran, the fellows in front began to run. And then the fellows in front of them began to run. And eventually the whole battalion ran. Left their ammunition after them, their heavy artillery, left everything after them. And today, that is known as the Races of Castlebar. Anyway, afterwards, they conquered all of Connaught, and Robert made the big mistake of leaving Connaught, and he went into County Longford, where he was absolutely defeated at the Battle of Ballinamok. Now, the Ballinamok is a very sad occasion in Irish history because of the terms that were made with the British afterwards by the French. They did agree that all the French troops would get safe passage back to France, but not for any Irishman. No Irishman was to escape. They spent 3 days rounding up the Irish fellas, and they shot them on the spot. Shot them or killed them with their swords on the spot. 3 men, however, managed to escape. They spent 3 days in a pothole until the English search had ceased. One of them was Captain Mangan. So they eventually made their way back down to Mayo. They were down in Ballycroy in the far end of County Mayo. And then after about a year they came in near Crossmolina into Keena. And Captain Mangan's people were quite influential in Castlebar. And they got a pardon for it, secured a pardon. Word of the pardon was sent down to Crossmolina, but the authorities in Crossmolina decided they would ignore it. Instead, they sent a troop of soldiers out to Keena, got Captain Mangan, and didn't execute him. They murdered him on the spot. He was killed by stones. And immediately they chopped his head off, brought his head into Crossmolina, and on the landlord's gate there was a spike, and they put the head on the spike. 2 troops guarding it, and it was kept there until the crows had every bit of the skin and flesh eaten. It was later reunited with his body and buried just over here in Athergool graveyard. Another one of the terms of the agreement was that any Irish person who helped in any way, their names would be given to the British authorities and the amount of help they had given. So Father Conroy, of course, had given help. He had directed Napoleon and his army, or Humbert and his army, away into Castlebar. So they came back Father Conroy was arrested. He was arrested on a Tuesday afternoon, brought to Castlebar, held overnight, and the following morning he was charged with 7 counts of treason. So he was charged, tried, convicted, sentenced, and executed, all in the space of 40 minutes. Now his body that evening was carried down by people from the parish here, and he is buried in Addergood as well. So Addergood is quite a historic place, even for those 2 reasons, those 2 men buried over there. However, we don't know the location of their graves, which is a great pity. Now, in 1937, a local man here, Michael Timoni, or Michael Timony, who was quite a wealthy man, a great folklorist, collected huge amounts of folklore, especially the Erris area, Irish folklore. He is now in the Folklore Commission in Dublin. Still hasn't been fully examined. You know, he died in 1937. He had been in he had been in Australia twice. He was involved in the gold mining in Australia, made lots and lots of money. It was he who donated the bell for the church out here, which we keep so reverently, rings so reverently every year now for the Titanic people. He also unveiled that monument, or donated that monument to Father Conroy down the road. So those were little episodes of our history. The most talked about part of our history, I'm sure, would have been the sinking of the Titanic. There were 14 people from this parish, in fact 14 people from County Mayo and all from this parish on the Titanic. No other small area in the world had so many people on the Titanic. So we have the Titanic Park here. We started off, I'd say, about 5 or 6 years before the centenary, when we discovered, a few of us, Paul Nolan and myself and a few more, we discovered there were actually 14 people from this area on the Titanic, and we felt they should be remembered. So one night on the 14th of April, went in, we said, we'll ring the church bell in their memory. This was at 2 o'clock in the morning. So we rang the church bell, and of course the next morning, word headed all over the village here. So there was a drunken crowd out there, like they went in ringing the church bell. But very quickly people discovered actually what it was. So in the following year, we had relatives of all 14 there to ring the church bell. And we devised a little system. The ship was sinking for 25 minutes. And once the brow went down and it went to the bottom, 25 minutes. So for the 11 people who were lost, we had 2 sad minutes of a dirge for each of the 11. That was 22 minutes. And for the 3 who were saved, we had 3 happy, joyous minutes. And we have done that every year since. Now, just coming up near the centenary, we decided we'd do something special. So we got a little bit of ground from the parish priest down there. We said we'd build a Titanic Park. So it was all done by voluntary labour. The week before the opening of the park, we had our cultural week here, in which the windows were unveiled in the church, and I'll tell you about the windows in just a minute. That was done by Mary Robinson, our former president, who lives here in the parish, lives over the road here. She also unveiled a little light down in the park, because when she became president, she unveiled a light in Horus and Lutheran, which comes on every night, as a mark of welcoming back to returning immigrants. She also unveiled a light down here, which has come on every night since. Of the 14 people, there were 11 women and 3 men. 5 people came from one village, people called Burke. There were Burke's, John Flynn's aunt and Mary Mangan. John Lynn's aunt and Mary Mangan. And there's stories about all three of them. For instance, the Burkes, there were three from the Burke household. There was John Burke, his wife Catherine, and his sister Mary. Catherine had been in America for a few years, and she came back around 1909 and met her boyhood sweetheart, John. And they got married and went to England. Lived in England for about 2 years. Mary was pregnant, Catherine was pregnant, and they decided to come back for Christmas. Back for Christmas, and then heard people talk about going to America. It was a big talk around the place. And of course, Catherine, who had been in America for a few years, said, that is really where my heart is. That's where I want to be. And she persuaded her husband, John, to go to America. And then his sister Mary said, well, I'm not staying here in the house on my own. If you're going, I'm going too. So she decided to go. There were only 2 other men on the Titanic. There was James Flynn, whose house is standing in the site down there now, or part of his house. There was James Flynn and Pat Mangan. And all the Irish people were down in the area of the ship known as the steerage area. The steerage area is the lower deck, the lowest deck of the ship. And of course we know how it got the name steerage. I used to think one time it had something to do with steering the ship, but no. It comes from the name of the lower deck on the boats on the Mississippi, where down the bottom deck the cattle were carried, and the American word for cattle, steers. So the steerage area is where the cattle were brought. Now all ships, the bottom deck is always called the steerage, even though on the Titanic it was absolute luxury. Of the 14 people from this parish in the Titanic, only 2 might ever have seen luxury like that. The 2 who had been in America. They may have and may not have. It was, we believe, the equivalent of a 4-star hotel today. So it was beautiful. Now the 3 Lahardane lads who were there, they wanted to see everything. They were rambling round the ship day and night. And one day they went into a store, and there in the store was a ladder leading up to the next level. So of course the lads were up, had a good look round, went up to the top deck, saw everything. And then eventually, on the 14th of April, which was Nora Fleming's birthday, it was her 24th birthday. That was John Lynn's aunt. She was celebrating her 24th birthday when the ship struck the iceberg. People from the steerage area were not allowed up. The doors were locked. Now they were opened later. But the 3 lads, hewed way up the ladder and that, brought a lot of their friends up. The 2 Bucks girls got on lifeboat number 16, but John wasn't allowed on. And his wife Catherine says, well, if John isn't going, I'm not going. I will stay with my husband and I will die with my husband, but I will not leave him. So Catherine got off. And then Mary said, well, if John and Catherine aren't going, I'm not going. I will stay with John and Catherine, and I will die with John and Catherine, but I won't leave them. So she got off. And when she got off, there was a bit of room left on the lifeboat. And a fine, big, strong woman from up the road here up in Buffalo called Annie Kate Kenny. Annie Kate got on. And that was wonderful, because Annie Kate kept notes of everything. She remembered everything, wrote everything down. She became very well educated in New York, became a nun and a teacher in New York. kept notes of everything and recorded everything about the sinking of the Titanic. In fact, she was the only one who ever came back. She came back for a week in the 1950s. Now, there were two young girls, two 14-year-olds, who would have been nieces or grandnieces of some of the older people on the Titanic. And they escaped. They were the only ones who were saved, those two girls. They didn't come back to Ireland, but their grandchildren have come back. And in fact, a few years ago, their grandchildren came back together. And thankfully, I had the honour of meeting the grandchildren. And they decided they would make a donation to the church, or to the area. So they donated a stained glass window, which is out here in the church, showing the rescue from the Titanic. Now, it was done by a local man, a local artist, and he did an absolutely super job at it. A man called Michael Coleman. Actually, he is American, but he's been here for the past 50 years. But a super artist. In fact, his rendering of the stained glass window is so perfect that we can make out two of the characters. Now, wasn't that wonderful? One of them from an old photograph, Pat Canavan. Another one, Mary Mangan. I'll tell you how he identified her in a moment. Then later, one of the relatives of those lost, that's why can't we, the relatives of those who were lost, donate a window as well. So they donated the second window, which you'll see in the church, which just shows emigration, as emigration is its theme. The man, three women and a man in a sidecar going away from the area. That's in direct proportion to the 11 and 3 who were on the Titanic. Now, I said I'd come back to something else. So, oh yes, how we can identify another person. There was a Mary Mangan from Carrigskean on the ship as well. And naturally, I'm sure her body went down with the Titanic, but it must have resurfaced. Because 3 weeks later, the body was found floating in the Atlantic, completely decomposed, completely unrecognisable. But it was identified by the watch she was wearing round her neck with her name inscribed on it, Mary Mangan. And thankfully we have that watch here in the parish ever since. Now, a lot of other things were done around the area as well. We said the Titanic, we opened the park. And the great thing about the park is everything built down in the park was built from stones, from the walls, round the gardens of the homes of the 14. In fact, the part of the house you see down there is a reconstruction of the house, the home of James Flynn. That was his home. The big gable we see is a reconstruction of the gables of 2 of their houses. So we are very, very proud of the amount of work which was done in the park. Now, sometime before that, outside the church one Sunday morning, well, this was 15 years ago, outside the church one Sunday morning, a few of the local lads were talking, and one of them says, well, you know, lads, the graveyard is in a terrible condition. Which it was. It was so bad you couldn't walk through the graveyard with briars and wings and bushes and everything. You wouldn't be able to find a grave except a very modern one. It was absolutely terrible. So the lads were talking about it, and someone said, well, you know, lads, we should go over there someday, spend a few hours in it and tidy it up. So they agreed, yes, we'll go over next Sunday. We'll spend a few hours and we'll tidy it up. That was 15 years ago. They haven't missed a Sunday since. It is now, I'm sure, one of the most perfect graveyards in Ireland. In fact, they've been given 3 national awards. And it was very much as well as the Titanic Park, very much the reason why Lahardane was awarded the Pride of Place trophy some years ago, or the Pride of Place Award. Now the Pride of Place Award is an award granted to one place each year within the 32 counties of Ireland. The county councils north and south have an input into it. They find out about certain places around the country where huge work has been done on a voluntary basis. Then they come and inspect those places. And thankfully, some years ago, Lahardane had been nominated, and Lahardane without doubt was immediately proclaimed the finest village, or the best in Ireland for voluntary work. Now they were shown the Titanic Park, the windows out in the church, the beautiful work done down the schoolyard down here, the graveyard in Adragool, the graveyard, the football pitch, everything up in Buffino. And without any hesitation, they awarded us the trophy, Ireland's finest village.
And thinking historically, what was the major sort of economic drivers in the area? I presume agriculture would have been dominant for a long time, but there was also a lot of craft too, I understand, was there?
Well, there was craft everywhere. In fact, quite recently, a man here, Michael Murray, he established where there were 17 forges in the area. Now 17 forges might sound huge today, but when you consider that 30 or 40 or 50 or 100 years ago, the only means of transport was the horse or the donkey. There were no tractors, there were no cars. Everything was done by the blacksmith. The tongs was made by the blacksmith. Everything used in the house near it was made by the blacksmith. So there was huge demand for the work of the blacksmiths. The horses, the carts, the machinery, the ploughs, the turf spades, the forks, the shovels, everything was done by the local men. And every village liked to have its own one, because the forge was, as well as being the forge, it was also the community-based little centre. It was the visiting house of the area. Men went in to talk about farming. Men went in to talk about machinery. But there were always 4 or 5 men there talking while the blacksmith was working. So that would have been the major industry. Naturally, there were plenty of carpenters, stonemasons. I won't call them builders now, there would have been stonemasons, because most things were built of stone. And some of them standing after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, so they must have been quite skilled. Thatchers. Most houses had thatched roofs. So there was a thatcher or a few thatchers in every parish. So there were blacksmiths, carpenters, stonemasons, thatchers. I won't say welders because they hadn't come at that stage. But naturally you had to have all those people and all those skills. Now you had teachers as well, but the teachers didn't have schools. It was usually what they called hedge schools, because teaching was banned for Catholics. Catholics were not allowed to be educated. And as almost all the people of this parish were Catholics, I'd say 99.99%. Well, no, not quite. 98, 99% of the people would have been Catholics. The need for education would have been in the hedge schools. And it's surprising the wonderful education that was done in those hedge schools, the people who came out from them. For instance, over in Foxford, in the hedge schools, we have some of people renowned throughout the world. In fact, the father of Chile would have been a man from Foxford, whose father was governor of Chile. From Foxford, educated in a hedge school. Yes, went to Spain, quite possibly. He went to Spain to study for the priesthood, but left and went to South America, which was all colonized by Spain. He became governor of Chile. But his son, there was one, father's name, just can't remember the father's name. The son was Bernardo O'Higgins. And Bernardo O'Higgins, after the father's death, he went from being pro-Spanish to anti-Spanish and led the rebels first in Argentina before crossing over to Chile. Now he's one of the few people, if ever you buy a bottle of wine, he's one of the few people, Irish people at least, ever remembered on a bottle of wine. Do you ever see wine, Santa Rita, 120? You know what that means? Well, that goes back to Bernardo O'Higgins in Chile, where he only had 120 volunteers with them to fight for their independence against the might of Spain. And one day they were kind of cornered in a mountainous area by the Spanish army, but they ran and came across a big mansion of a house owned by a lady called Rita. I don't know her name was. But she brought them in and gave them shelter. And when the Spanish army arrived, they said, no, nobody here. I hadn't seen any strangers or anything. The Spanish army left and they were free. Bernardo O'Higgins with his 120 in the house of Santa Rita. And hence the name of that wine. Now, he went on and grew from strength to strength to strength, and eventually got freedom for Chile. So that's it. One little thing was about the hedge schools of the area, how wonderful they were. And
well, hedge schools have literally been outside, you know, they take their name from the hedgerows, I suppose, where they would be, but would they have been outside? Or did the hedge signify that they were just hidden schools?
Just hidden schools.
Yeah.
Just hidden schools. Well, now, quite possibly they weren't actually hidden schools. They probably took place in somebody's house or some building. But they were known as the hedge schools.
Yeah.
Because in those days Catholicism was banned.
Yeah.
It was banned until 1829. It was as late as 1829 we were given Catholic emancipation. Now, they were allowed to practice their religion before that, but weren't legally recognised. Mm. Hence, you didn't have Catholic bishops or anything, or at least not to be seen, or Catholic dioceses, Catholic churches. For instance, the church here in Lahardane was built in 1840, just after Catholic emancipation. They couldn't have built it before that, or at least not before 1829.
And as
no, you mentioned earlier was about the making of whiskey.
Yeah, from one staple of the tradition, the religion, to the other staple, which was the drink. How did they typically produce? What would they have drank? I suppose back in those times, and how would they have produced it?
Well, the likes of Guinness. Guinness started in 1759. That's when Arthur Guinness opened his brewery in Dublin. Now he did have a brewery much farther down Kilkenny area, Tipperary, long before moving to Dublin. And in Dublin they founded the brewery in 1759. That is what, 260 years ago, 270 years ago, 260 years ago. And has been going since. So naturally they had to sell quite an amount. It was quite, well now, relatively speaking, it was very, very cheap. But money was very, very, very hard to come by. In fact, I knew people, in my young days, they would have talked about having bought pints of Guinness for 2 pence. Just 2 pence a pint. Now I remember it at 9p a pint. That was when the pence, 240 pence in a pound, when you got 26 pints for a pound. But then a pound was very hard earned that time. However, people did have their own liquor. Maybe not beer, much stronger than beer. They made their own spirits, their own whiskey. It was always made from barley. Barley on the turf fire, the barley, but they had to have yeast. And they found it quite difficult to get yeast. The bakeries weren't allowed to sell yeast to the ordinary people. But they were able to get bits here and bits there, and there was enough to keep going. Now, not everybody made poaching. There were poaching makers, I suppose, nearly in every townland or in every village. There would be a poaching maker who mightn't sell it. He would give a bottle out to every one of his neighbours when they were brewing. But then if he needed something, maybe wanted to buy a sheep or a pig or something, quite possibly the currency used would have been the bottles. Usually when they made the poaching, it was put into bottles, and the bottles were buried out on the side of the hill. Nobody knew where they were buried except the person who buried them. So nobody could find them. One local man now actually has told me that he was with his uncle when they buried the poaching. He knows roughly the area where they buried it, but he can't find it. And it's still there on the side of Nephin. So it was used, would say, as a currency as well as a tonic. People like to have a drop before going to bed. People frown very much on people who abuse it. Some families or some makers would have abused the poaching, and they were not liked by their neighbours. They were very much frowned upon. It was regarded as a great asset, something to be highly respected, not abused.
And of course, traditionally they would have used it for other uses besides.
It would also have been used for treating cattle, sick cattle, anything like that. Anything which they thought was good for, they used it.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just for drinking, it was used as a tonic.
Yeah.
Rather than go to a doctor when there were no doctors as such, or people couldn't afford it when there were no doctors as such, or no GPs. So that was the cure for everything.
Yeah. And was there, there's Ilan Naglashi has become synonymous, I suppose, with that. Do you know where that started or where it came about?
Well, I don't actually.
No.
I don't actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I've heard of it often enough, but I don't really know the origins.
Yeah.
I must find that out.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's great.
Now, one other little thing.
Yeah.
We had mentioned earlier how we're here between the shores of Lahardane and the foot of Nephin. I read quite recently, well not quite recently, a couple of years ago, where Mayo County Council brought out, this is supposed to be a fabulous book, The History of Mayo. And I came to Lahardane. And of course they gave a very literal translation of Loch Con, the lake of the greyhounds. They couldn't have been farther wrong. Con, after which Connacht was called Connachta, the people of Connacht, Connachta, the followers of Con. There was two great kings in Ireland one time. They divided the country between them. There was Con and Mo. Mo, his followers were called Mua, and the province, the southern part of the country, La Moa, or Cuiga Moon. Cuiga Moon, the fifth of Mua, or of the followers of Mua. Up here in northwest of the country, the Con, and his followers were the Connachta. And you have Cuiga Connacht, the province of the followers of Con. So the lake is Loch Con, Con's lake. The lake of Loch Con, of King Con. And then in the distance, or just over here, not too awfully far away, you have Nephin Mountain. Some people from outside the county call it Nephin Moor. That's Big Nephin. Because there's a little mountain behind it called Nephin Bill. Little Nephin. But this here is Nephin. Nephin. There are a few explanations as to how it got its name. But the one I like best is the Fianna. You've heard of the Fianna, the great warriors of Ireland. The Fianna spent a lot of their time in this part of the country, led by their great ruler, Fionn McCool. And one day Fionn is said to have climbed the mountain. He got to the top of the mountain and he looked round and he saw the beautiful scenery, the magnificence of everything. He says, "This is paradise." Fionn's paradise. In Irish, Nephin, anglicised Nephin. So Fionn's paradise. So there is paradise in the distance. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
One other little thing that I remember about the area. When I was a little child growing up, no, I didn't grow up in here, I grew up nearer to Galway. And every morning I'd go out and look at the land, look down, you'd see the mountains in the distance. And sometimes you'd see one mountain with snow in it. So that was great, wonderful. We want to get snow. So you ran to school, you told the lads, the snow is coming, there's a mountain on the big one. So I met a man from Charlestown one day, and he told me the very same thing. There was a man called John Murphy, who wrote a beautiful play called The Country Boy. So John Murphy wrote The Country Boy, and he was always fascinated. You could see him from Charlestown, and he was always fascinated by Nephin. And one of his dying wishes was that he would be buried on the slopes of Nephin. And he is. He's buried up the road here, into the right. And thankfully I had the honour of giving the graveside oration. I was going to say at his grave, but not at his grave as it happened. It was a terribly wet day. It was teeming from the heavens when we buried him. So we decided we'd adjourn to the pub as quickly as possible. So the graveside oration was given down there. So John Murphy is buried here. I mentioned we had the great Archbishop John McCain, who was famous. Well, they were really the most famous people now from the parish. But we were very, very proud of our little area. And we're almost dead centre here in County Mayo, right in the middle of Mayo. So it's a wonderful place to exude out from.
And would you have sort of known much about Admiral Brown then from Foxford? You reminded me when you were speaking about Chile and other South American.
Yes, Admiral Brown became, and then he was
William
Brown. What country was he in?
Argentina.
Argentina, yes, yes. So Argentina and Chile. So both are both well served by Foxford people.
Yeah.
And it's strange how Foxford, they talk so much about Admiral William Brown. They have his figure there, we'll say, on the bridge. But they rarely ever talk about the other two.
Yeah.
Bernardo Higgins and his father, who are very, and as I said, the only little thing we have on is the bottle of wine. And I often would say, forget the bottle of wine someplace now, going to a supermarket or something, and ask them to know anything about what does the 120 mean, but nobody seems to know.
No.
And I often wonder why the manufacturers and the distributors, especially when they're distributing Mayo, why they don't emphasise that.
They've probably forgotten themselves at
I
this stage.
suppose the people don't even know.
Yeah.
It's like another great brand of wine, a very, very popular brand of wine. As it flies off the shelves over barrels. Robertson's. Gives Robertson's Pet or whatever it is, the Robinson Wine Company of Dublin 24 UK. That's on the label, it's Dublin 24 UK. Now, is something else I can do?
Nothing I can think of now. It sounds absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, we couldn't have planned it better, and that's just off the cuff.
Do you want to talk about Puchin Island?
Yeah.
Do you know anything about Puchin Island up in Lochcon? You know,
I was
gas
asking about
That's
the
I
gas.
don't.
Oh, right.
I don't.
Oh, yeah,
You
yeah.
did,
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.